Hey everybody, welcome to the show. This is Nels. Thanks for joining me today for a session on our normal product management training session, and then today's topic is persuasion tips. I talked about a bunch of persuasion tips last week in the live session, and this is a continuation of that. So 4 more persuasion tips. So without any further ado, let's get started. Let me hide that. So basically, I've put this under the rubric of how to make better business presentations, because that's what a lot of us do as product managers. We do that a lot, and becoming more persuasive in our business presentations is really great, and it helps us a lot. So let me talk a little bit about that and tell you why it's so important. But first, let me just do a little introduction. So I'm your host, Nels Davis. I'm the author of the book, The Secret Product Manager Handbook. I have an upcoming course on persuasion for the purposes of making business presentations better. I am a product manager. I have a full-time job as a product manager, also a coach, also a consultant. I do consulting on product management. If you like this video, please like, share, and subscribe. Without any further ado, let's get going. So I'm going to do a quick recap on part 1 of this series on persuasion tips. So let's just get into that real quick. I'll bring up the slideshow a little bit easier to see. So the first question I think you might be asking is, why do you need to be more persuasive? And the fact is that we're product managers, we're technologists, we really love technology, we love our solution. And the fact is, though, that the facts about our technology tend to not be as persuasive as we think we are. You know, if you just go and give a presentation, if somebody says, tell me what's going on with your product, and you just give them a bunch of facts and a bunch of technology, generally speaking, that presentation is not going to go very well. You really need to be thinking about the needs of the person you're presenting to and the story that goes behind your product, as opposed to the facts. You know, the reality is that one of my mentors said this to me once, who's a product manager, VP. We were flying back on a plane from a big company meeting in Florida, and he said, we are all salespeople. And this is really true for product managers, everybody in the organization. You're salespeople. You always need to be thinking about selling your ideas, selling the work you're doing as being valuable, selling your own thinking as being valuable. And of course, there's lots of situations where the reality is you are trying to sell specifically things. You're trying to get people to make a decision that goes your way. So you're trying to get them to buy into your recommended decision. Or you sometimes are involved in sales, so you're trying to make the sales process go faster or be more successful. Or you might be trying to motivate your developers and get them on board with you. Or you just might want to have happier customers. Or a lot of times what you're trying to do is sell an idea to executives and get them on board with your new idea, because they have to give you money in order to implement your idea. So those are a lot of the reasons why we need to become good at persuasion. And it's in this context of business presentations where we really need to be able to figure that out. So that's why we need to be thinking about persuasion all the time. So let's now think about what this means, right? So the fundamental rule of persuasion is that, and it's very simple and it's a little bit simplified, but it's basically accurate. And if you think this way, it will take you a long way. Basically, people make decisions emotionally. They have to get bought in emotionally before they can make a decision. And then they will justify their decision, often post facto or post hoc, using facts and using reason. And we think of ourselves as rational animals, but the reality is that we are really emotional animals with a rational brain tagged on. And I mean, we got that in the last few 100,000 years, but the emotional part of the brain is a lot older and has a lot of power. And so we just have to be able to remember that we have to do this engagement of emotions in order to have people make decisions the direction we want them to make. Now, there's a few side effects of this. A lot of the fact that we were working with a lot of persuasion is working with the old brain. Well, the old brain has a lot of sort of pre-programmed behaviors that we sometimes have to get around. And it has ways of thinking about the world that we have to understand when we're trying to be persuasive or trying to get people to understand what we're trying to tell them. Of course, we do have this super powerful forebrain that really does respond to logic and facts, but we need to bring the other old brain along with us. And so a lot of the tips, and I shared these tips, this is the part one set of tips, are focused on that. One of them, things like having a goal. Well, that's really a tip for yourself, so you know where you're trying to get. But using stories to engage. Stories are really an ancient thing for humans, and they're super engaging for humans if you can tell stories about conflicts that you've overcome or that your customers have overcome or that your prospects need to overcome and how you're going to help them. Those are the types of stories that you're typically telling in a sales type presentation. Now you then follow those up with facts, or you may intersperse facts into the stories. But the point is that the stories are this way of emotionally engaging. Pre-handling objections. This is actually, again, working with the subconscious of your audience. Your audience may be listening to you and they may be having concerns or worries that don't surface to the level of conscious thought, but they're still bothering the people. And they may be all different kinds of things, but if you can think and determine in advance what are the things that are likely to be bothering your audience, even if they don't articulate those things, and then you can address those concerns as you're presenting, it'll do a lot to calm down that old brain that's panicking a little bit about what you're telling it in a way that the conscious brain the conscious brain may not even notice that it's happening, but the person will feel much more comfortable. So practice is another thing. This is really more for this is more for just you're going to get better at doing things if you practice. I have more on all of these tips in last week's video, and I'll put a link in the show notes to the previous video about all these topics, and you can learn more in that. So let's move on a little bit. I do want to quickly, though, say that I am working on a course that should be delivered this quarter, Q2 of 2019, about how to become better at making business presentations, using a lot of these ideas and drilling much more down and practicing and learning specific techniques like for storytelling and learning specific techniques for how to present and how to be better at practicing how to make better presentations in general. It won't get you ready for TED, but it'll get you ready for the next time you have to go up in front of your executives. So I welcome you to get on the mailing list, the mailing list for that course, and I'll give you more information if you join the mailing list. I also have a little freebie that you can get by joining the mailing list. I'm going to really demystify this skill for you. One of the skills that great business leaders and all sort of business leaders that have gone a long way in business, one of the skills they have is being effective at presentations. It's something I think a lot of us struggle with. I certainly struggled with it for many years and had to practice and learn a lot of things. And now I really want to share that because I've gotten to the point where I'm considered a persuasive person, and I can give you some tools to help you be that as well. So moving on, let's talk about more persuasion tips. So this is really the set of tips that we'll talk about today. The first one is about waiting, leaving some space for people to fill. And I'll talk about why that's important, how it can work. There's a sort of side or inverse of the waiting, which is also the listening. What do you do when you're listening when someone else is talking, and how can you make use of that? Another really important thing to use and do while you're presenting is to use conversational language. I'll talk about what that means in a little bit more detail and why it's so important. Then there's a process of guiding the listener or the audience to let them know how this thing if I'm proposing a project or something, how is it going to happen? How is it going to happen in real life? What's the path we're going to take? And what are the obstacles that we know we're going to run into, and how are we going to handle those? And these are things, again, that can help the audience feel more confident that you know what you're talking about, that you're trustworthy, things like that. And then I'm going to end with this great set of ideas from a guy named Andy Raskin about how he models out sales presentations. Pretty cool stuff. So the first thing is this idea of waiting and leaving a pause. Now, a lot of times, and I certainly do this, we sort of feel like we need to rush through our presentation or our talk, whatever it is, and get to the end and get all the information in. And in a situation where, for example, maybe you want some interaction from the audience, but you're not getting much of it, a pause can be very powerful. So that's one way that you can use a pause, and I'll come back to that. The other way that you can use a pause is it doesn't actually, let me start to put that a different way. I started that sentence wrong. A lot of times we worry that it's going to make us look like we don't know what we're talking about. But the reality is a lot of times a pause, if it's not too long, sometimes even if it's very long, to be honest, makes it look like we're very thoughtful about what we're saying. This actually also goes along with another idea, which I don't talk about really here, but the idea of not talking so fast, of speaking more slowly, of being more modulated in how you speak when you're presenting. And that can be a useful technique as well. But specifically, I want to talk about the use of the pause to help elicit questions. So what happens when there's a pause, a long pause, and there's an audience, is oftentimes people feel obligated to fill that space. And so it can be a way to get people to speak up in an audience. Sometimes this doesn't work, but it works a surprising amount of time. When you put a long pause in, somebody in the audience will chime in and ask a question, make a statement, clarify something. And at that point, you can start to have a conversation, which is really great. And it enables the audience to start getting engaged. And what happens often, once that dam has broken, then you start to have even more conversations going on. You can get these conversations to go with this pause. It's a really great thing to do. Sometimes there's an alternative, which is this. Sometimes it feels like, oh, I want to interrupt. I want to wait. I want to not wait for the person to ask that question and interrupt and start giving my answer. This is usually not a good idea. Usually you really want to let that answer spool out. It depends. Sometimes you might have time. Sometimes somebody's making a speech or something during your time, and sometimes you need to gently stop that. But generally speaking, you don't want to interrupt in this situation. Now, often when these questions come up, it may not be a question you want to answer. So you can actually, as the presenter, you can choose whether to answer it or not. And there's a lot of different things you can do in terms of answering the question as well. You can choose to answer a different question that might be related. You can, if you don't know the answer to the question, you can say, I don't know the answer. Typically, the best practice then is to say, let me get back to you, and then promise a time when you can get back, that you will get back. And sometimes if you don't know the answer, you are going to be tempted to make up an answer. And that's typically not a good idea either. But what you can do, if you do know something about the question, or if you've thought about it, I've often used the technique of, that's a really good question. We have thought about that question and we haven't yet figured out the right answer to that question. And so let me get back to you when we've discussed it more, or let me bring you into a conversation about that, something like that. That can be very opening, and it's a way to preserve a sense of control over the topic without having to actually answer the question if you don't know the answer. So that's sometimes a way to do that. It particularly works if you have thought about that question and you don't know the answer yet. So the wait and the listen, two very important things. Don't interrupt, and let that pause sometimes engender conversation. Now, I've mentioned this earlier on, this idea of conversational language. And first of all, why is it very important? And the reason is because, again, this whole brain thing, the human brain has defenses against engaging. It's really saving its energy to make sure that when the saber-toothed tiger comes out of the woods, it's all prepared and all the resources are available to escape from the saber-toothed tiger. And so the brain naturally has all these defenses against other kinds of interruptions, like listening to somebody say something about a product idea or something like that. But we also have built-in sort of circuits that are related to conversations. Human brains crave conversations. In fact, if you've ever been walking around or somebody asks you a question, you're on the street and somebody asks you a question, even if you don't want to answer that question, even if you don't want to pay any attention to that person, oftentimes you're really compelled. You may be able to resist it, but you're compelled to answer. And this is true even not just on the street, but it's true in a situation like a business presentation. And so if you can work in some questions in a business presentation, for example, if you're giving a demo to a prospect and you've maybe had some previous conversations with the prospect, so you know some of their issues, and you say, would you like me to show you how our software solves the issue that you mentioned? You're going to be more specific than that. That is likely to engender a response. Or you might ask, if you want to do a more open-ended question, you might want to say, well, I'd like to show you how our software, I've just shown you how our software solves that problem. What do you think of that solution? And that's a more open-ended question. So they can answer that in a lot of different ways. So often an open-ended question. But the point is that because you're asking a question of that person, that creates a conversation where they're somewhat compelled to answer. Now, they can resist it, of course, but their natural response is going to be, I should answer that question. Now, the same is true if you use words like you. So instead of talking about our software and I've got this thing and let me show you our software, you might think about flipping those things around and making it much more about you. I want to show you how we solve your problem with our software, or what have you tried in the past to solve this problem? An open-ended question. And those sorts of things are much more likely to engender a response because they're conversational. So ask questions, use the word you. And a lot of open-ended questions sort of have this structure. Tell me about something. What happened then? Who did you talk to then? When did that happen? All these things, they really make people want to answer. So that's the conversational language. Now, the next tip is really about guiding the audience. And there's two components to this. One is the path, as I mentioned before. So one is the path. And you can think about the famous adage for giving a presentation. Tell them what you're going to tell them what you told them, or tell them and then tell them what you told them. And that's an example of a path, right? It's also an example of another really useful concept I don't really talk about here, but the idea of chunking. So you have tell them what you told them, or tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. It sort of organizes, it creates some organization that the audience can fit what you say into. It's very valuable when you're talking about this path to give a future vision, but also to tie back to what you've already talked about. So I talk a lot about, in my various presentations, I start with talking about a problem that the customers might have, or that I've gone through, or something like that. And as I go through the presentation, I often bring that back to, and here's how this is solving this problem, here's how this is solving this problem. And that's an example of bringing that back. Now, the other thing you want to do is not talk about things that aren't that important to the path. And of course, you have to have some amount of judgment about that. There's a lot, anything could happen in the future. And typically when you're doing this type of thing, you want to talk about maybe the happy path, the most obvious path, the most likely path to occur. Now, you might acknowledge that there's other possibilities, but you want to focus on a path that lets people see how we can get from the current state to the desired state, and give them a story or a visual picture of how that's going to come about. Now, if you're thinking about, for example, creating a new feature in your product, you might talk about, well, I'm going to talk to these. I've gotten some feedback from these customers. I'm going to use that to create a prototype. I'm going to review the prototype with these customers, and then I'm going to go review it with some other customers. And using that feedback, we're going to create the first version, and then we're going to roll that out slowly and get feedback, and we might make some updates. So that's just an example of talking about the path. Now, the other thing you want to do in guiding the audience is to think about the potential obstacles and how you're going to address them. Because again, the audience has got that saber-toothed tiger mentality going on, which is saying, well, that project will never work. There's going to be lots of rocks and potholes on that path. There's a big mountain that they're not going to be able to get over, speaking metaphorically. So if you can address those things, it reduces the anxiety of the audience, just in the same way that pre-handling objections does. You can also include explanations for how you're going to achieve things. For example, if you're doing, like I've got an example, if you're doing a demo here, you may say, well, look, when you're onboarding, you have to get this existing data from your other system, and you have to load it into this system. Now that's an obstacle. And everybody knows when they get a new piece of software that they may have to load stuff into the new software, and it's going to be annoying and hard. But everybody knows it's going to happen, and so that's a source of dread, really. I mean, think about yourself when you get a new thing. There is always that source of dread of, am I going to be able to upgrade? Am I going to be able to get my old data in there? All that kind of stuff. If you acknowledge that and you say, yes, this is going to be a thing you have to do. It's going to take this amount of time. We built some tools for you, but you still have to do it. That will go a long way to reducing their dread. Now, they might still be annoyed or bothered that they have to do it, but they're not going to dread it. It's going to go from being an emotionally laden, probably unstated fear to something where they can account for it rationally. And that makes it much more manageable for them. And for you, if you want to close that sale, if you acknowledge this, that's going to help you be able to close the sale. Now, generally speaking, when you're describing the path, you're going to want to mention the key obstacles that you're going to run into. Even for the happy path, there's going to be key obstacles. Like for my example of making the software where I'm going to talk to some customers and I'm going to make a prototype. The prototype may be, I know that some of the customers are going to not be happy with the prototype. I know that it may be difficult to get the resources to create the prototype. There's all kinds of things that might happen, and I want to acknowledge those up front and say how I'm going to handle those, right? How I'm going to mitigate those. So that's another really important tip. So finally, those are the first three. Now I want to talk about this great model that Andy Raskin has. He has a great article called Want a Better Pitch? Watch this. I'll put a link in the show notes. It's on Medium, and it's about this great presentation that Elon Musk did. And so Andy analyzed this presentation and broke it down into these 5 steps. And I'll have to look at my slide to see what it is. So the first step, name the enemy, meaning state the problem that is out there that must be solved. And this is just like a story. I mean, if you think about a story structure where there's a problem, something happens, and then eventually the outcome of the story is the problem is solved and the person is changed, or maybe the problem is not solved and the person might still be changed. But this is the same kind of thing. Name the enemy is like find the problem, and then make something about why we should deal with this problem now. What is it about this time that makes solving this problem a thing that is the right thing to do? That's the next thing. And then give a picture of what the future will look like if this problem is solved. This is a little bit different from my basic story structure because it's sort of talking about the results at this point, but that's fine. You can totally do that. Then you want to talk about how you're going to get to that promised land, right? What are the obstacles to achieving that result? How are you going to get around them? And then finally, you show that you actually have the capability to do this. Now, this is similar to a way I talk about telling stories about telling a story about a prospect's problem that is unsolved that we might be able to make money by solving. And so this is the same kind of structure that Andy Raskin is talking about. So this is a really great model. As I say, I'll put a note in the show notes. And if you can think about structuring your business presentation something along these lines, and not every business presentation will fit this exactly, but you can use components of this, and certainly the types of thinking. You may be talking just about a feature that you want to implement, but in some sense that feature is going to be there to solve some problem that your customer has. So if you can name that problem, name the enemy, and talk about why it's the right time to solve that problem, why it's the right time to attack that enemy with your new feature, and how great the world is going to be for your customers when this feature exists. Those are all the things that he talks about in the first 3 points. And then, of course, you want to talk about here's what it's going to take to create this feature, right? Here's the things we have to figure out. Here's the technical challenges. That's like the obstacles. And, of course, we want to talk about why we think we can do it, which, of course, is because we've done that before, because we have experts on our team, stuff like that. So that's the model. I think it's a really great way to think about persuasion and to do a business presentation. So see if you can make use of that. So I have a little bibliography. I will put this in the show notes. I don't expect you to read all this right now. If you want to learn more about me and my stuff, I have a book that I wrote called The Secret Product Manager Handbook. I think it's a really good book. A lot of people have agreed with me on that. You can get it on Kindle or paperback from Amazon. You can go there. If you think this book is great and you want to share it with your team, get in touch with me directly and I can get you a bulk order at a bit better price than you can get on Amazon. You can follow me on Twitter. I tweet a lot about product management and I share a lot of product management articles. I have my blog, secretpmhandbook.com/blog, and there's a lot of stuff on there. Not so much new, unfortunately, at the moment, although it's going to start ramping up, but a lot of good old material that you might find interesting and valuable, and I welcome you to check that out and share it. I also have a podcast, All the Responsibility, None of the Authority. That's at alltheresponsibility.com, and that one is going pretty actively right now. And of course, I have the YouTube channel, which you're watching right now. So and don't forget the Persuasion course, secretpmhandbook.com/persuasion, and get on the list for that. Anyway, till next time, this is Nels. Hope you enjoyed these tips and hope you can make use of them right away. I think they're pretty useful, and I try to use them whenever I give a business presentation, which is a lot. And, everybody walks up to me after these presentations and says, that went really well. So that's my goal, right? I think I want the presentation to go really well. And then hopefully that's going to be your goal as well. Okay. If you like the video, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it with your friends. If you have product manager friends who maybe you feel need a touch up on their persuasion skills, this video and last week's might be useful for them. Additional resources are in the post below, and I love to get your comments, and they help me decide what to do for my next video. So until next week at 7:30 p.m. on Monday night, this is Nels Davis signing off. Thanks for joining. Bye-bye.